both for the invitation to join you tonight and the opportunity to share some thoughts with you about a region which has always been troubled, but which is now occupying the world's attention, and whose the fate of whose politics will tell us a lot about the stability and the well-being of all of us in the years ahead. The original theme that we had agreed upon for tonight was the status of the Middle East peace process, and I won't forget that either in my remarks tonight. But in many respects, that's taken a back seat to the day-to-day excitement and drama of what's happening on the streets of the region. So I thought, rather than focus on the larger question of peace in the Middle East, I would try to provide a little bit of context for what we're watching, and then maybe something of a prognosis that helps us look ahead and suggest some directions, particularly for American policy. As I mentioned in conversation with some of you this evening, the United States does not determine alone what happens in this region, but we do have an oversized role, and therefore an oversized responsibility, and therefore what we do or fail to do carries tremendous consequences for our own national security and the well-being of people in the region. So talking a little bit about American policy, I think, is quite important. I was reminded the other day of the title of the autobiography of the late King Hussein of Jordan, whom I'm sure all of you remember. He entitled his autobiography, "Uneasy Lies the Head," and he chose that for the ostensible purpose of noting how much danger he had been in through the more than 45 years that he sat on the throne in Jordan. A number of assassination attempts, pressures from some radical Arab regimes to overthrow Middle East monarchies, including that of Jordan, pressure from below, from a population in Jordan which is composed of a disparate number of elements, including a kind of Palestinian underclass of refugees who have not fully been absorbed or not fully assimilated into the politics of the kingdom. But it seems to me that the king's title for his autobiography also reflected a reality about the Middle East that can start us off tonight as we do this survey of what's happening. Because what we saw, for example, in Egypt was not a revolution. It was a decapitation of the head of a regime. President Hosni Mubarak was forced from office. You saw yesterday on the streets of Cairo the jubilation, day of celebration, perhaps up to 1 million people, not only in Cairo, but outside of Cairo and other cities, celebrating the fact that the head of state had been deposed after 30 years in office. But what hasn't changed in Egypt is the system of governance, the regime in which Hosni Mubarak acted as a leader. And so thinking about how uneasily lies the head in some of these Arab countries will tell you something about the perils of leadership, not just the challenges and how hard it is, but it'll also tell you how dangerous it is. After all, Mubarak himself came to office on the heels of the assassination of his predecessor, Anwar Sadat, in 1981. Anwar Sadat came to office in 1970 after the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who died literally from exhaustion and overwork in trying to resolve a number of inter-Arab crises. So the uneasy lies ahead, in effect, it not only represents the challenge of King Hussein's lifetime, but I think a way to mark many of the crises and problems that we're going to talk about this evening. In general, one can suggest that what we are watching in the Middle East is a chronic problem turned into a crisis. And I choose these words carefully because the Middle East has been troubled, what I've called a bubbling cauldron of despair and problems and insecurities for many, many decades. And it has led to changes that are quite fundamental in this region, changes of which we've been aware for the last perhaps decade or so, but which continue to inform much of what is happening in that region, even apart from the particular issues of today, the demonstrations and the upheaval. First of all, if you look around this region, the main actors, the main players in the drama of the Middle East, who used to be Arabs, are no longer Arabs. And in fact, it's the periphery of this region which is largely determining what happens and where the region is heading. Iran, which is, as you know, not an Arab country, Turkey, which is not an Arab country, and Israel, which is not an Arab country. Largely, that troika of countries is playing a far more significant role in determining both the present and the future of this region than any individual or collective set of Arab countries. And this is the first time in recent memory, certainly in the current period, post-World War II period of Arab independence, where one has to look, in effect, outside the Arab world for the major sources of power and influence that shape Arab politics. Second major factor is that what used to be a monopoly that states had in this region of power has now shifted. And so there now is at least a condominium of power, if not a transfer of power, to non-state actors and to what's now being called empowered individuals. I'll give you one example. Since 1982, the State of Israel has fought 4 major military confrontations with Arab adversaries. Not one of them has been against an Arab state. They fought 2 intifadas, Palestinian uprisings. They fought a major war in 2008-2009 against the Hamas-led Palestinian society in Gaza. And they fought a major war in 2006 largely against Hezbollah, a militant Islamic Shia group that is exercising growing influence in Lebanon. Now, Arab states were somewhat, I would say, peripherally involved in several of these conflicts. But unlike the period before 1982, when we talked about Arab-Israeli wars, we still talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's been this shift of power and influence from states to these non-state actors and individuals who act outside of the traditional state system. The third major change in this region, which informs much of what we're watching today, is the profound difference between the secular pan-Arab nationalism which characterized Arab aspirations in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. That has now changed as the most dynamic influence and force in this region has become Islamist politics. And I would suggest that we not confuse Islamist politics with necessarily radical Islamist politics. There's a debate which I will talk about shortly with regard to organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood. Are they or are they not an acceptable partner within political systems? But even as we have that debate, the reality is that 20, 30 years ago, the rallying cry in this region was the idea that the Arab world could coalesce around the ideology of pan-Arabism, largely a secular ideology, largely a secular ideology established by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and propagated through Egyptian efforts throughout the region. And now there's this dynamism called Islamism, which has won people's hearts and affections, and which has in fact displaced, to a large extent, what used to be the dynamism of Arab nationalism. This has been documented well in the academic literature. In scholarly books, the collective nature of which might be called while we all slept. Because in fact, if you look back at the period between the late 70s and mid 80s, all of the signs for what we are living with today were evident. We saw the rise in Lebanon of a militant Shia group representing a disaffected, essentially pluralistic majority population that was not willing to accept a subordinate role within that society, became Hezbollah. We saw the rise in Palestine of the same phenomenon, of a group of Islamist activists dissatisfied with the failure of the nationalist Palestine Liberation Organization to achieve the goals that Palestinians were supporting. And this became Hamas in the late 1980s. The United States, in fact, helped foster this growth in Afghanistan. You remember after the Soviet invasion, the United States provided substantial material and military support to Islamist groups that were fighting against the Soviet occupation, out of which, directly, not indirectly, came Al-Qaeda. And the story goes on throughout this region. A transition was underway during this period, which was all around us, but no one quite understood this transition or the implications of it. So you have these rather fundamental changes. And the question that then is posed is not necessarily why we were all asleep at the switch, but what is it about the Middle East that represents such a challenge for good governance, for democratic governance, for peaceful change, that has given rise to the problems that I just indicated. One can suggest that there are a number of such problems which reflect upon a Middle East which is in some respects beset by endemic problems that appear almost impervious to change. When I left government in 2005, I gave one of my first public lectures the somewhat frivolous title of Tyrants and Tycoons, Theocrats and Terrorists, in trying to describe this Middle East that was made up of largely dysfunctional leadership around the region. And in fact, it proved to be not as frivolous as I would have hoped, because in fact, as you look around this region, it is made up of tyrants and tycoons and theocrats and, unfortunately, a large number of terrorists. What we now see, it's also made up by a large number of people willing to go out on the streets to demand freedom and openness and democracy. But that's been hard to see under the cover of these regimes which have become so sclerotic and so unchanging and so devoted to a status quo that was so dangerous, characterized by several elements that bear analysis. You remember a few years ago, Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, wrote a book called Alexis and the Olive Tree. And the thesis of his book was relatively simple and straightforward. Globalization, in his words, had become the watchword for an economy, a global economy, that required everyone's participation. And if you didn't participate, if you thought you could extract yourself or stand apart from the global economy, you would become, in Friedman's words, roadkill on the way to a successful future. When you look at the Middle East, and in a sense, Friedman could have been thinking about the Middle East as he was thinking about that roadkill. Because it's a region that has largely not engaged, I don't want to say disengaged because it never was, but largely not engaged with the rest of the world, apart from the energy resources that this region exports, the oil and the gas. The Middle East exports nothing that the world requires. In fact, one of our own undersecretaries of state just a couple of years ago did a study, traveled around the region to explain that only 7% of what the Middle East produces outside of gas and oil is exported, because only 7% of what they produce is exportable. Nobody else wants to buy the rest of what the Middle East produces. It's not that the people of the Middle East are not capable of producing things that the world needs, being part of the engine block of our automobiles or part of the technology revolutions that are taking place. Societies in the Middle East just haven't organized themselves in ways that interact effectively with the global economy. And so you have a situation where, as one of my supervisors of my dissertation at Columbia, the late Charles Isawi, said, whatever economic model you plug into the Middle East, the only thing that comes out is oil. And that was said about 50 years ago, and it's probably just as true today. The related issue is that even the windfall profits that have been made periodically, actually with increasing frequency in the Middle East, are still not invested as wisely as they might be. We know about the sovereign wealth funds in which Middle Eastern states collect the income that they're deriving from oil and gas, and then they invest it in the United States, Europe, elsewhere, assured of a certain rate of return, but mostly assured that there's not going to be an illegal process of capturing their money. They're very attracted to the soundness of our legal systems. Too little of that money is invested in their own societies. And I'm not just talking about that old trickle-down effect. Middle Easterners would say they'll even take the trickle-down effect, but there's not even that much of a trickle down into the economies of these societies. The third factor that we're watching now in real time is the almost total absence of anything that we would call democratization or the process of democratizing this region. Now, there are those in the academic community who have made what I would think is a specious and false argument that there may be something in Arab or Muslim culture that predisposes people in that region against democracy. I think that's nonsense. It may not be the democracy that we enjoy, it may not be the democracy of European or Latin states, but there's nothing inherently antithetical to the tenets of Islam or to the tenets of Arab nationalism that would preclude their thinking about and implementing democratic changes. Part of the challenge here may have been, and still might be, that some Middle Eastern regimes thought they could adopt what might be called the China model of development. You know, China has this idea, which they're playing out in real time, of effecting rather dramatic economic transformations and a kind of economic democracy, but doing so within the overall context of a largely undemocratic society. And China, therefore, for some Middle Eastern regimes, has represented a very interesting model, a model in which perhaps it would be possible to achieve economic growth and to spread some of the benefits of the oil and gas wealth, but to maintain the tight political controls that these regimes have been so accustomed to holding on to. Now, we don't know if the China model is going to work over time. It certainly is working in the short term, but it doesn't seem to be working at all if there is such a model in the Middle East. And therefore, the false argument that regimes made that they could live in these two worlds, a world in which economic freedoms were opened up a little bit, but political freedoms remained absolutely shut tight, has proved to be a false set of dreams. And then you have, underpinning this absence of democracy, are the litany of societal ills, which interestingly are not cataloged as effectively by those in the West as they have been cataloged by Arabs themselves. In 2002, the United Nations Development Program asked a large number of Arab intellectuals, public policy figures, academics, and others to do a self-study of what it was that ails Arab societies. UNDP, the UN Development Program, thought it would be wise, and I agree that it was wise, that this study not be done by those from outside the region who would carry their own cultural and other biases, but rather let the people of the region look at themselves, look in a mirror and see what they came up with. And in that first report in 2002, the Arab Human Development Report, as it's called, there were 3 fundamental deficits that were defined by the Arab participants themselves. A deficit of freedom. In other words, the things that we're now talking about, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the freedom to associate, to form political parties. All of these, the Arabs found, were in great deficit in the Arab world. Second was a freedom of what they called knowledge, or a deficit of knowledge, meaning that in thinking about how students from kindergarten through universities were being trained, there was no sense of imbuing students with the ability to think. Rather, it was largely rote memorization. And so the system of education was perpetuating a system outside of the educational sphere, which had become stagnant and static. And the third deficit pointed out by the Arab participants in this study was a deficit of women's empowerment. The argument was very simple. If you want to succeed as a society, you want to draw upon the strengths of 100% of your citizens. And in most Arab societies, 50% of the population have very low glass ceilings about participating in public life and in professional life because of discrimination against women. This was an Arab Human Development Report, not done by Westerners. There have been 5 subsequent reports by the United Nations Development Program, and almost no metric of any progress in any of these areas has been registered. So you have this huge problem of a lack of democratization. On the one hand, you have a recognition of it on the part of the intellectuals, the public policy leaders. On the other hand, you have regimes in which, or societies in which, there hasn't been a way to actualize any of these results and translate them into policy. And what it's led to, therefore, is a region which, when you start to list its ills, you get a headache. It's a region in which governments lack legitimacy, in which even succession is an uncertain phenomenon, where there are crises over basic human needs. You know, we talk in academia about the Maslow hierarchy. You know, once you fulfill the basic needs, you can move up to the more advanced needs. In most Arab societies, those basic needs are not being filled. There's no jobs. People are living in poverty. Healthcare systems are in horrendous disarray, where they even exist. The demographic time bomb. When Sheila and I first served in Egypt in 1979, the US government persuaded then President Anwar Sadat to receive an expert from the United States to talk to him about population growth in Egypt. This fellow came over and met with Sadat with all kinds of charts and graphs, which indicated that if Egypt could achieve 0 population growth that day, the population in Egypt would more than double till 2025, when the curve would start to level out and maybe even begin to decline a little bit. In other words, Egypt was in a population crisis in 1979 and before 1979. When we first arrived in Egypt, population was about 35 million. Well, Egypt didn't achieve 0 population growth that day, still has not. Population is now about 82 million. And yet the ability of Egypt to support a population of 82 million has not kept up with numbers. So you have this demographic time bomb. And we know in our society how hard it is to create jobs for the annual number of entrants into the job market. Imagine when that annual number is so far exceeding the capacity of the economy to produce jobs that in effect, people just give up. They don't even pretend that they're going to be able to find a job. So against this backdrop, it may be a touch easier to understand what we are watching in such mesmerizing fashion on the television in the Middle East. And Egypt, in this respect, is both a case study of what's happening, but we also know, given Egypt's traditional influence within the region, that what happens in Egypt will have a catalytic and influential impact on what happens in the rest of the region. So what's happening in Egypt, and why is it important? I mentioned earlier, we may be in a pre-revolutionary situation in Egypt, but we are certainly not yet in a revolution. The military in Egypt, which took power from the monarchy in 1952, continues to see itself in some respects as the embodiment of the state, as the defender of the society's values. It's much more than even what the literature calls a Praetorian role. It's not just that the military stands behind the throne of power in order to protect the throne of power. The military, in effect, always creates the space in which political power exercises power in Egypt. Now, for the first 58 years, until last Friday, this was a fairly easy objective for the military to accomplish, because the first three presidents, actually the first four presidents of Egypt after the revolution, General Naguib, Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak, all came from the military. And the last three, Naguib never actually took his uniform off before he was shoved aside by Nasser. The last three simply took their uniforms off and became civilianized leaders who in effect reflected the army's role in governing that society. So when we look at Egypt today, we find with fascination that the army has given over nothing of this role to the opponents of Mubarak. And in fact, the opponents of Mubarak sought the army's favor during the 18 or 19 days that it took for them to overthrow Mubarak. An extraordinarily interesting phenomenon. The competition for the army's affection, its support, its loyalty. But in effect, it was never an affection that was up for sale. Because for the army, the only real question over the period of that 18 or 19 days was not whether to transfer power to civilians. Rather, it was, has Hosni Mubarak become a liability? And since the demonstrators focused all of their attention on the person of Hosni Mubarak, with a couple of other leaders, the Minister of Interior and a few others, effectively, once the military kind of got it, and once the light bulb went on and they said, you know, the way to maintain our influence is to dump Mubarak overboard, they did. You remember last Thursday, Mubarak gave a defiant speech, I'm not leaving, I embody the values of the nation and so forth. Well, the next day he was gone. Because the military knew that it had come to a point where he had become the liability in a system that they are intent upon preserving. So as we watch the events in Egypt unfold, we may be watching a pre-revolutionary situation, but I'm not even sure we are. We may be watching a change in the way the military opens up political space, but not in any respect a change in the attitude of the military towards politics. And there will always be limits in the Egyptian military as to the scope and extent to which politics can take place in that society. Now that said, in some respects, those who are hoping for stability in Egypt may find this very comfortable. Not so much because they like military rule, but they may like the idea that the military at the end of the day will safeguard stability in Egypt. And here's where one of the real question marks over the period of the last 7 days has arisen. Because the military, in seeking to preserve its role while opening up a different kind of political space, may be opening up political space to groups who have a dedicated view of undermining the system. In other words, they may be bringing the revolutionaries into the space that they are creating. And I'm thinking in this respect specifically of the Muslim Brotherhood. You hear a lot in the news today, the Muslim Brotherhood is moderate, they've given up violence, they've eschewed terrorism, and I'm not so sure. Muslim Brotherhood, what we know about them, created in 1928 in Egypt. Virtually all of the ideological and philosophical underpinnings of all of Islamism, ranging from so-called moderate Islam to the more radical Islam, all of the ideological underpinnings have emanated from Muslim Brotherhood writings, all of them. There have been very different tactics on the part of the Brotherhood itself, as opposed to the organizations that have become offshoots of the Brotherhood. Al-Qaeda is an offshoot of the Brotherhood. Takfir al-Hijra, which is the group that assassinated Anwar Sadat, is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Tactics are quite different among these groups. But there is not, in my assessment, any fundamental difference in overall strategy. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt today maintains as its objective the creation of an Islamist state in Egypt. Now, the reason I mention this is because in the 7 days since Mubarak was toppled, the influence and involvement of avowedly Muslim brother politicians has grown exponentially in Egypt. The head of the Constitutional Reform Committee, appointed by the military to effect constitutional amendments within 10 days or 2 weeks, when you examine his writings, Tariq al-Bishri, he says outright, Egypt must become an Islamist state. There is no such thing as secular Islam or secular Arab politics. Tariq al-Bishri, when he was an administrative court justice, ruled that the sale of natural gas, which has been contracted between Egypt and Israel, was unconstitutional. And when he was appointed to head the Constitutional Reform Committee, first question he asked was, why hasn't the gas been cut off to Israel? A prominent member of the committee, Sabhi Saleh, who many of you may have read about in a New York Times profile as one who was jailed during the uprising 2 weeks ago, is now a member of this committee. And there are a number of markers, including the prayer service yesterday in Tahrir Square, which was led not by radio, by a very influential and radical Islamic cleric, but led in person by Sheikh Qaradawi, who was booted out of Egypt by the Mubarak government and allowed back in to lead prayer services in Tahrir yesterday. Now, I mention this, and I don't want it to be misunderstood. If Egypt chooses to increase the influence of Islam in its governing structure, Islam is already the state religion of Egypt. This is a choice that countries and people should be allowed to make. I'm not sure, however, that the majority of those who went out in the streets the other day, or certainly those of us outside of Egypt, fully understand the insinuation of the Muslim Brotherhood into the current politics of Egypt. And the reason I question this is we actually now have the first polling data of attitudes during this uprising. A polling organization actually operating out of Princeton, New Jersey, a little advertisement for my hometown, named Pector Polls, conducted a poll, a fairly reputable poll, according to the experts, during the uprising in Egypt. And they found that less than or fewer than 1% of the those polled wanted to see the Muslim Brotherhood actually govern. So there may not be the kind of popular sentiment in favor of Muslim Brotherhood involvement in politics as the military may be making room for the Muslim Brotherhood in politics. This becomes quite important for us to watch. The reason it becomes quite important is that the opposition in Egypt is diffuse and lacks leaders. We recognize the name of Mohammed al-Baradei, who was the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's a classic case of a leader who runs as fast as he can to find out where the crowd's going and jumps in front and says, "I'm now leading the crowd." The man lived in Vienna until the 4th day of the uprising. He's now come back as a kind of media hero. Is he a leader? Is Wael Honan, the Google executive whose high-tech activities represented a way of binding people together and bringing them out on the streets, is he a leader? Are the old opposition parties in Egypt capable of transforming themselves from their sclerotic inactivity to become equal partners in this political space? Very challenging to believe that that's the case, and that's a possibility. So you have these factors at play, which even in Egypt, or maybe even especially in Egypt, have to give us pause as to whether or not what we are watching is in fact what we hear in breathless commentary on the television, the beginning of the democratic spring in the Middle East, whether or not we are seeing the decapitation of one regime and the imposition of a different kind of regime in which the system has not changed and in which, in effect, almost nothing else changes within that system. Now, what does this present as a problem or as a policy dilemma for the United States? The answer is it's a huge policy dilemma. The Obama administration, I think, actually handled the Egyptian uprising quite well, because it recognized from the outset that whether or not we particularly liked the Mubarak regime or didn't, the fact is that we had two competing sets of very vital national interests at stake, and they were in competition. On the one hand, you had our values, our political culture, our traditional support for democracy around the world. And this has been a characterization of every one of our administrations going back almost to the beginning of the Republic. Sometimes we've pursued it a little more actively, sometimes a little less actively, but the fact is that we have a political culture which believes that the blessings of our democracy are those which should be shared with the rest of the world. The only difference sometimes is whether or not we think we have to share them despite what people want, or we have to share them because people want them. But that's for a different discussion. So on the one side of this policy dilemma, you have this situation in which the Obama administration had to position itself in favor of those demonstrating for a democratic opening. But the Obama administration and the American policy community also recognized that for 30 years we have gotten tremendous value and significant returns on our large investment in Egypt. Now the investment is large, probably upwards of $70 billion total in military and economic assistance. We've accomplished some purposes with that assistance. We transformed the Egyptian military from one that was reliant on Soviet doctrine, Soviet arms, Soviet training, to a military which effectively is interoperable with our own. And if you needed a case study to prove this, go back to the first Gulf War in 1991, when two Egyptian divisions fought alongside our own troops in pushing Iraq out of Kuwait. So this notion that we could create an interoperable military force that would actually serve our interests has proved itself. Not only that, our economic assistance has largely helped to change the shape of the Egyptian economy, even if it hasn't totally fixed the economy. Again, harking back to our own experience, when Sheila and I arrived in Cairo in 1979, there were a lot of broken pieces in Egyptian infrastructure. Buildings in Cairo were literally collapsing because of the intrusion of water and wastewater. There were no water and wastewater systems that were effective. Electricity was sporadic, episodic at best. And business people, because the telecommunications system didn't exist, literally would save up phone calls until Thursday or Friday, fly to Cyprus, make a weekend's worth of phone calls, and then fly back home to do business the next week in Egypt. Today, Egypt has a modern telecommunications system. It has modern water and wastewater systems. It actually, for a while, exported electricity. It was generating enough. So in other words, the infrastructure of the country was changed, and it was due in large part to the American partnership. And we got a lot out of this partnership. Egypt has been a mainstay in the search for peace in the Middle East, has been very active in trying to bring about not only Palestinian and Syrian involvement in negotiations with Israel, but helped shape an Arab political consensus which in 2002 resulted in the so-called Arab Peace Initiative, which is a fundamental change in Arab state policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. We've gotten benefits out of a strategic and intelligence relationship about which I can't even speak tonight, because if I told you, I'd have to shoot you. But we gain a tremendous amount of actionable, real-time intelligence regarding our national safety from our relationship with Egypt. So this has not been a one-way relationship, and it therefore was imperative for the Obama administration not only to follow the sentimental route of supporting democracy, but also trying to measure that off against the strategic imperative of maintaining our relations with an Egypt that was going to be friends with the United States. And I think until now, the administration has done a reasonably good job. The question is going to be, though, whether or not this can continue, and how much harder it will get as the impact of Egypt now spreads throughout the region. Bahrain, after all, which, as you've seen, has developed into a far more deadly confrontation between regime and the crowd than even happened in Egypt. Bahrain hosts the United States Fifth Fleet. It's a very small country. If the monarchy doesn't manage to find a way to ally itself, to get ahead of the curve with demonstrators, if the monarchy ends in Bahrain, one can foretell with pretty good certainty that the Fifth Fleet will need to move. Now, you may have seen in the papers the last day or two that Saudi Arabia would never let this happen. Who knows? Because Saudi Arabia also faces its own challenges, perhaps not of the same sort as Bahrain, but the majority population in the Saudi eastern provinces, which is where most of Saudi oil is located, is Shia. And the Saudi monarchy and religious establishment is Sunni. So the Saudis are scared every day of every year about the degree to which the Shia population of those provinces may decide that they're going to act up. And will the Shia majority population in Bahrain have an influence on the Shia population in the eastern provinces, both of which may end up being influenced also by the Shia leadership of Iran. So Bahrain itself is going to represent, in some respects, in the immediate term, a far more challenging problem for the United States than Egypt in the short term. Jordan, where I started. Jordan has been a stable ally and partner of the United States now for more than 30 years. We had a couple of hiccups along the way. In 1990, King Hussein couldn't quite decide to break all his relations with Saddam Hussein. We now know why. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, after Hussein had died, 1 million Iraqis fled into Jordan, destabilizing a kingdom which, as I mentioned earlier, is composed of a diffuse and disparate population, very hard to manage without the influx of refugees, the more so with the influx of those refugees. And Jordan is now experiencing domestic unrest. People are looking to Yemen. I don't know about Yemen. Yemen was a failed state before this started. It will be a failed state after it ends. The problem with Yemen is not so much how it is governed, but whether or not the government becomes the protector of the organization called Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. And whether or not this geographical base now becomes the geographical base that Al-Qaeda has been looking for since it lost Afghanistan, or lost its base of operations in Afghanistan. And so we may find ourselves, as we're pulling out of Iraq and pulling out of Afghanistan starting next year, with the very fateful political decision of whether or not we need to commit ground forces in another area, not so much to counter terrorism, because we will fight against terrorism anywhere, but whether or not we need to commit ground forces because of the degree to which a state provides the support and home basing for terrorist organizations. On the last of these policy challenges, and with this I'll conclude, and I know there are going to be some questions and comments which I look forward to. The last of these is really the issue in which I thought I was going to focus on tonight, and that's the peace process, which we tend to forget these last couple of weeks. What peace process? Who really cares about the peace process? What makes the peace process interesting today is not only that it involves issues of great importance to the people of the region. The issues in the Arab-Israeli peace process have resonance far away from the immediate arena of Arab-Israeli politics. But they're also important because we now know, with the leaks of papers from Palestine, so-called Palestine papers that were leaked a few weeks ago in Al Jazeera, that Israel and the Palestinians are agonizingly close to a meeting of the minds on some of the most contentious issues that they face. Now, there are two important ramifications of this. Number one, it lays to rest a canard that we hear sometimes that, well, there is no Palestinian partner. It's a challenging Palestinian partner because it's the first time in history that a people under occupation is being asked not only to negotiate their way out of occupation, but while they're doing so, to negotiate the creation of their state. Not an easy task for anyone. But we now know that there has been a partner, because the Palestinian Authority, under the leadership of President Mahmoud Abbas, made some rather remarkable concessions that were reciprocated or reciprocal to remarkable concessions made by the then Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. And we now know that these two leaders reached beyond the constraints that usually are imposed upon leadership in this arena and thoughts and developed policies that actually looked like peace was achievable. So the first major implication of these so-called Palestine papers is that there is a partner for peace. You've had an Israeli system that has produced an Ehud Barak, who went to Camp David with some fairly forward-leaning ideas, that has produced the Yitzhak Rabin, whom Yasser Arafat called until the day he died a true partner in peace, who produced an Ehud Olmert. We've known about them, and now we know that Mahmoud Abbas is also a partner for peace. The second implication, and with this I will conclude, because it relates to American policy. The second implication of these Palestine papers ends up as a kind of rhetorical question. If the Arabs and Israelis were this close to reaching an agreement, where was the United States? Why didn't the United States, which fancies itself the indispensable third party, the honest broker, the mediator, why weren't we there to build the bridge between the positions of the two sides? And I'll conclude with the thought that I said earlier. We don't, as a country, determine what happens anywhere in the world, including in the Middle East. But in the Middle East, we do have an outsized role. And if you have a situation, as we had in 2008, of an Arab partner and an Israeli partner reaching out to each other and getting close to building a bridge of their own, then it is up to the United States to offer ideas and bridging proposals. And our absence or our unwillingness to do so is a question that we will need to analyze in the period ahead. Because if there's going to be any hope at all for a Middle East peace process, it's not going to be that the two leaders themselves will be able to consummate what they started. We are going to have to play a far more effective and a far more ambitious role than we have over the past decade plus. And if we do, I believe not just for sentimental reasons, but for very hard-headed strategic reasons, we can actually achieve a peace settlement in this region. Thank you very much.